Marcus stared at his phone screen, the text message glowing in the darkness of his apartment. 3 simple words from someone he had considered his closest friend for over 5 years: "Sorry, can't help." The message came after Marcus had reached out during the most difficult period of his life, when his father was in the hospital and he desperately needed someone to cover his shift at work. This moment would become the catalyst for Marcus's transformation, though he didn't know it yet. Like many people, he had lived his life surrounded by relationships he thought were genuine, never questioning the subtle signs that had been there all along. The journey that followed would teach him not just how to identify fake friends, but how to fundamentally rebuild himself into someone who could never again be manipulated or destroyed by others. The psychology of fake friendships runs deeper than simple betrayal. These relationships exist on a spectrum of deception, from unconscious self-interest to calculated manipulation. Marcus's friend Jake represented something far more common and insidious than outright malice. He was what psychologists call a fair-weather friend, someone who maintains relationships only when they provide benefit without cost. For years, Marcus had noticed the pattern without recognizing it. Jake was always available when Marcus had tickets to concerts, when he needed help with technology projects that Jake found interesting, or when Marcus was dating someone Jake wanted to meet. But whenever Marcus faced genuine hardship, the time his car broke down, when he struggled with depression after his mother's death, or now during his father's illness, Jake mysteriously became busy, distant, or offered empty platitudes instead of real support. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. He spent the next several days reviewing their friendship with new eyes, and what he discovered shattered his understanding of human relationships. Jake had never initiated contact to check on Marcus's well-being. He had never offered help without being asked first. Most tellingly, Jake had a habit of subtly undermining Marcus's confidence with comments disguised as jokes or concern. "You're probably overthinking this opportunity," Jake would say when Marcus got excited about a new job prospect. "You know how you tend to get your hopes up." These comments, delivered with a smile and a pat on the back, had slowly eroded Marcus's self-confidence over the years. Marcus began to realize that Jake had been engaging in what psychologists term covert aggression, a form of manipulation designed to maintain dominance while appearing supportive. But Jake wasn't alone. As Marcus examined his social circle with this new awareness, he discovered a network of relationships built on convenience, manipulation, and unspoken hierarchies. There was Sarah, who only called when she needed someone to listen to her problems but was never available when Marcus needed support. There was David, who borrowed money regularly but always had excuses when it came time to repay, and who had a talent for making Marcus feel guilty for even bringing up the debt. The pattern became clear: Marcus had unconsciously surrounded himself with people who saw him as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be valued. This realization forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about himself: he had allowed these relationships to flourish because of his own weaknesses and psychological vulnerabilities. Marcus realized he had been what psychologists call a people pleaser, someone whose self-worth depended on being needed and liked by others. This trait made him an ideal target for manipulative individuals. He said yes to requests even when they inconvenienced him. He avoided conflict even when his boundaries were being violated. Most dangerously, he had confused being useful with being valued. The psychology behind fake friendships reveals itself most clearly in moments of genuine need. Authentic friends demonstrate what researchers call costly signaling: they make sacrifices for the relationship when it truly matters. Fake friends, conversely, engage in cheap signaling, offering support that costs them nothing while avoiding any real sacrifice or inconvenience. Marcus began to study human psychology with an intensity born of personal pain. He read about attachment theory and discovered that his childhood, marked by parents who were often absent due to work demands, had programmed him to equate love with utility. He learned about narcissistic personality patterns and recognized them in several of his supposed friends. Most importantly, he began to understand the concept of emotional vampires, people who drain others' emotional energy while giving little in return. The research painted a clear picture: fake friends operate according to predictable patterns. They practice what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, providing just enough positive attention to keep their targets engaged while primarily taking what they need. They excel at reading people's psychological vulnerabilities and tailoring their approach accordingly. most insidiously, they often target individuals who are naturally giving, empathetic, or seeking validation. As Marcus delved deeper into these psychological patterns, he began to recognize the sophisticated manipulation tactics that had been used against him. Jake, for instance, was a master of what's known as gaslighting light, subtly making Marcus question his perceptions and judgments. When Marcus expressed excitement about achievements, Jake would respond with lukewarm enthusiasm coupled with subtle warnings about potential disappointments. Over time, this had trained Marcus to doubt his own positive emotions and rely on Jake's more realistic perspective. Sarah employed a different but equally effective strategy. She practiced emotional dumping, overwhelming Marcus with her problems while showing little interest in his life. This created an artificial intimacy Marcus felt important and needed while actually being used as an unpaid therapist. When Marcus occasionally tried to share his own struggles, Sarah would quickly redirect the conversation back to herself or offer superficial advice that made it clear she wasn't really listening. The revelation that shook Marcus most profoundly was understanding how these relationships had systematically weakened him over time. Each interaction had subtly reinforced negative beliefs about himself. Jake's undermining comments had made him more cautious and self-doubting. Sarah's emotional dumping had left him feeling responsible for others' happiness while neglecting his own needs. David's financial manipulation had taught him that his worth was measured by what he could provide to others. Marcus realized that he had been living in what psychologists call a trauma bond with multiple people, relationships characterized by intermittent reinforcement, emotional manipulation, and gradual erosion of self-worth. These bonds are particularly insidious because they mimic genuine intimacy while actually serving to control and diminish the target. The turning point came when Marcus decided to conduct an experiment. He stopped reaching out to these friends and waited to see who would initiate contact. The results were devastatingly clear. Jake didn't call for 3 weeks, and, when he finally did, it was to ask for help with moving apartments. Sarah only reached out when her boyfriend dumped her and she needed emotional support. David's only contact was a casual text asking if Marcus wanted to grab drinks, notably, after David had received his paycheck. This experiment revealed the transactional nature of these relationships with stark clarity. Marcus understood that he had been functioning as an emotional and practical ATM for people who saw him as convenient rather than valuable. The realization was painful, but it also marked the beginning of his transformation. Marcus began to study the characteristics of truly authentic relationships and contrasted them with what he had been accepting. Genuine friends, he learned, demonstrate consistency in their care, reciprocity in their support, and respect for boundaries. They celebrate successes without reservation and offer help during difficulties without being asked. Most importantly, they value the person for who they are, not for what they can provide. The psychological research supported what Marcus was beginning to understand intuitively. Healthy relationships are characterized by what researchers call secure attachment patterns. In these relationships, both parties feel safe to be vulnerable, confident in the other's support, and free to grow and change without fear of abandonment or judgment. The relationships Marcus had been tolerating showed all the hallmarks of insecure attachment. They were unpredictable, conditionally supportive, and ultimately damaging to his psychological well-being. As Marcus absorbed this knowledge, he began to recognize that his journey would require more than simply identifying fake friends. It would demand a fundamental transformation of his own psychology. He would need to develop what psychologists call emotional sovereignty, the ability to maintain his sense of self-worth independent of others' validation or approval. This transformation would prove to be the most challenging and rewarding work of his life. The first step in this transformation was developing what Marcus came to call strategic detachment. This didn't mean becoming cold or uncaring, but rather learning to observe relationships with clinical objectivity. He began to notice patterns in how people approached him, the language they used, and the consistency between their words and actions. Marcus discovered that fake friends reveal themselves through what researchers call incongruent communication. Their words often don't match their actions, their emotional expressions seem forced or exaggerated, and they show a pattern of making promises they don't keep. Most tellingly, they demonstrate what psychologists term selective empathy. They can understand and respond to emotions that serve their purposes while remaining blind to feelings that would require sacrifice on their part. This analytical approach allowed Marcus to see his relationships with unprecedented clarity. He realized that Jake had never once asked him a genuine question about his inner life, his dreams, or his fears. Their conversations always centered around immediate, practical matters or Jake's interests. Sarah had never remembered important dates in Marcus's life or followed up on significant events he had shared with her. David had never offered to treat Marcus to anything, despite Marcus having paid for countless meals and activities over the years. The pattern extended beyond these three to encompass most of Marcus's social circle. He began to understand that he had unconsciously constructed a social environment that reinforced his role as a giver while providing little genuine connection or support. This realization was devastating but also liberating. It meant that he had the power to change his circumstances by changing himself. Marcus's transformation began with what he called the Great Silence. He stopped initiating contact with his suspected fake friends and began observing their behavior with scientific detachment. He also started studying his own responses, noticing how he felt compelled to fill awkward silences, to offer help before being asked, and to minimize his own needs to avoid seeming demanding. This period of observation revealed the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that had kept him trapped in these unhealthy dynamics. He discovered that he had been unconsciously rewarding bad behavior while failing to recognize and appreciate genuine kindness. When someone was consistently available and supportive, Marcus had taken their reliability for granted. When someone was unpredictable and occasionally cruel, their rare moments of kindness felt intensely meaningful, a psychological phenomenon known as intermittent reinforcement. The research on intermittent reinforcement explained why Marcus had found it so difficult to distance himself from people like Jake. Unpredictable rewards create stronger psychological bonds than consistent kindness. This is why gambling is addictive and why people often feel more intensely connected to those who treat them poorly than to those who treat them well. Marcus realized that several of his relationships had essentially been psychological gambling. He kept investing emotional energy hoping for the occasional jackpot of genuine connection. Understanding these psychological mechanisms was crucial, but Marcus knew that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough to change his patterns. He needed to develop new neural pathways, new automatic responses, and, ultimately, a new identity. This would require what psychologists call conscious competence, deliberately practicing new behaviors until they became second nature. The transformation Marcus was embarking on would challenge every assumption he had about relationships, self-worth, and personal power. He was beginning to understand that the man who destroys his weak self, the self that needs validation, that fears conflict, that mistakes being used for being loved, can never be destroyed by others. But reaching that level of psychological sovereignty would require him to confront not just fake friends, but the deeper psychological patterns that had made him vulnerable to their manipulation in the first place. As Marcus stood at the threshold of this transformation, he felt a mixture of fear and excitement. The journey ahead would be difficult, requiring him to let go of familiar patterns and relationships, even when that meant periods of loneliness. But he was beginning to glimpse the possibility of authentic connection, genuine self-respect, and the kind of psychological strength that could weather any storm. The path forward was clear. He would need to become a student of human psychology, a master of his own emotions, and, ultimately, an entirely different kind of person, someone who attracted genuine friends because he had first learned to be a genuine friend to himself. Marcus had been implementing his Great Silence for 6 weeks when the predictable patterns began to emerge with mathematical precision. The fake friends in his life responded to his withdrawal exactly as psychological research suggested they would, revealing the artificial nature of their connections through their desperation to restore the previous dynamic. Jake was the first to break. His initial response to Marcus's reduced availability was casual dismissal, busy with work, I get it. But, as weeks passed without Marcus reaching out to initiate plans or offer help, Jake's messages became increasingly frequent and manipulative. First came the guilt trips disguised as concern, haven't heard from you in a while, hope everything's okay. When that failed to restore Marcus's previous availability, Jake escalated to what psychologists call hoovering, attempting to suck Marcus back into the relationship through false intimacy and manufactured emergencies. The psychology behind Jake's response illuminated the predatory nature of fake friendships. Research shows that manipulative individuals experience what's known as narcissistic injury when their sources of supply, whether emotional, practical, or social, become unavailable. This injury triggers a predictable sequence of behaviors designed to restore control: love bombing, guilt manipulation, artificial crisis creation, and, finally, character assassination if all else fails. Marcus watched this progression unfold with clinical fascination. Jake's love bombing phase involved sudden expressions of deep friendship. "I was just thinking about how much our friendship means to me," and invitations to activities he knew Marcus enjoyed. When Marcus remained politely distant, Jake moved to guilt manipulation. "I feel like I've done something wrong, and I miss hanging out with my best friend." The artificial crisis phase brought dramatic revelations about Jake's supposed struggles that required immediate emotional support and practical assistance. Throughout this escalation, Marcus maintained what he had learned to call compassionate detachment. He responded to Jake's messages with polite but non-committal replies, offering general well wishes without engaging emotionally or practically. This approach allowed Marcus to observe Jake's manipulation tactics without being drawn back into the toxic dynamic. The most revealing aspect of Jake's behavior was his complete inability to simply accept Marcus's new boundaries. A genuine friend, facing reduced contact, might express concern and ask directly if something was wrong, but would ultimately respect the other person's space. Jake, conversely, seemed incapable of accepting that Marcus might have legitimate reasons for creating distance. This inability to respect boundaries is what psychologists identify as a key characteristic of narcissistic and manipulative personalities. Sarah's response followed a different but equally predictable pattern. As an emotional vampire, she had relied on Marcus as a primary source of emotional regulation, someone who would absorb her negative feelings and reflect back sympathy and validation. When Marcus stopped being readily available for her emotional dumping sessions, Sarah experienced what researchers call emotional dysregulation. Her initial attempts to restore the previous dynamic were more subtle than Jake's. She began sending Marcus long, rambling messages about her problems, clearly expecting detailed responses and emotional labor. When Marcus replied with brief, supportive but detached responses, "That sounds difficult, I hope it works out," Sarah escalated to more dramatic crises. The psychology of emotional vampirism reveals itself most clearly in moments like these. Sarah didn't actually want solutions to her problems; she wanted someone to absorb her emotional distress and make her feel better through their attention and sympathy. This is why she became frustrated when Marcus offered practical advice instead of emotional absorption. Genuine friends seek support to grow and improve their situations. Emotional vampires seek support to avoid taking responsibility for their emotional well-being. Marcus began to recognize that Sarah's friendship had been entirely one-directional. In 5 years of relationship, she had never once asked him how he was doing and waited for a genuine answer. She had never offered practical help during his difficulties. Most tellingly, she had never shown interest in his successes or achievements unless they somehow related to her own interests. David's response to Marcus's withdrawal was perhaps the most illuminating because it was so transparently transactional. Within 2 weeks of Marcus's silence, David reached out with a familiar request: "Hey man, could you spot me $40 until Friday?" When Marcus politely declined, explaining that he was being more careful with his finances, David's response revealed the purely mercenary nature of their relationship. Instead of expressing understanding or asking if Marcus was going through financial difficulties himself, David became irritated and defensive. "I thought we were friends," he said, making it clear that in his mind, friendship was defined by Marcus's willingness to provide financial assistance. When Marcus suggested they could hang out without spending money, David suddenly became too busy to meet. This interaction crystallized an important psychological principle for Marcus: fake friends will often explicitly define the relationship in terms of what you can do for them. They may not state this directly, but their actions make it unmistakably clear. When the practical benefits end, so does their interest in maintaining contact. The research on transactional relationships helped Marcus understand why David's behavior felt so jarring. Genuine friendships are characterized by what psychologists call communal orientation. Both parties are concerned with each other's well-being and willing to help based on need rather than keeping score. Transactional relationships, conversely, operate on exchange orientation. Help is given with the explicit or implicit expectation of equivalent return. David had never demonstrated communal orientation. He had never offered to pay for Marcus when Marcus was short on money. He had never suggested free activities when he knew Marcus was struggling financially. He had never even expressed curiosity about Marcus's financial situation or offered non-monetary support during difficult periods. The relationship existed solely for David's benefit. As these patterns became clear, Marcus began developing what he called his authenticity detection system, a set of psychological tools for quickly identifying genuine versus fake friendships. This system was based on observable behaviors rather than words, focusing on consistency, reciprocity, and respect for boundaries. The first component of this system involved what Marcus termed the investment test. Genuine friends invest in the relationship during good times and bad times, while fake friends only invest when they need something or when investment costs them nothing. Marcus began paying attention to who initiated contact, who suggested activities, and who was willing to expend effort or resources for the relationship. The second component was the boundary test. Authentic friends respect boundaries even when they don't understand them, while fake friends push against boundaries or make the boundary setter feel guilty for having them. Marcus started setting small boundaries, declining invitations when he was tired, saying no to requests that inconvenienced him, and observing people's responses. The third component was the celebration test. Genuine friends celebrate your successes with enthusiasm and without reservation, while fake friends either ignore your achievements or find ways to diminish them. Marcus began paying attention to how people responded when he shared good news, looking for signs of genuine happiness versus forced enthusiasm or subtle undermining. The fourth component was the crisis test. This was the most revealing. Genuine friends offer help during difficulties without being asked, while fake friends either disappear during hard times or offer empty platitudes without practical support. Marcus's father's hospitalization had been an unintentional crisis test that revealed the true nature of his relationships with stark clarity. As Marcus applied these tests to his social circle, the results were sobering. Out of approximately 15 people he had considered close friends, only 3 demonstrated consistent authenticity across all measures. This realization was initially devastating. It meant that most of his social life had been built on illusion and manipulation. However, this revelation also provided Marcus with unprecedented clarity about what genuine friendship looked like. The 3 authentic friends in his life, Emma, Carlos, and Jennifer, had consistently demonstrated the behaviors that Marcus now recognized as hallmarks of genuine connection. Emma had been a constant presence during Marcus's father's illness, offering practical help without being asked and checking in regularly on Marcus's emotional well-being. She had never asked for anything in return and had consistently celebrated Marcus's achievements with genuine enthusiasm. Most importantly, she had always respected his boundaries while making it clear that she cared about him regardless of what he could do for her. Carlos had demonstrated authenticity through his consistent reciprocity and respect. Their friendship involved equal give and take, with both parties initiating contact and suggesting activities. Carlos remembered important dates and events in Marcus's life and followed up appropriately. When Marcus had gone through his depression after his mother's death, Carlos had offered both practical support and emotional presence without making Marcus feel like a burden. Jennifer had shown her authenticity through what Marcus came to recognize as costly signaling. She made real sacrifices for their friendship. When Marcus had needed someone to cover his shift during his father's illness, Jennifer had rearranged her own schedule without hesitation. She had also demonstrated genuine investment in Marcus's growth and well-being, offering honest feedback when he asked for it and supporting his goals even when they didn't directly benefit her. Studying these authentic relationships helped Marcus understand what he had been missing in his interactions with Jake, Sarah, David, and others. The difference wasn't just in behavior, it was in the fundamental orientation toward the relationship. Emma, Carlos, and Jennifer approached their friendship with Marcus from a position of genuine care and investment. They were interested in his well-being for its own sake, not because of what he could provide to them. This understanding led Marcus to a crucial realization. The problem wasn't just that he had attracted fake friends, it was that he hadn't recognized or properly valued the genuine friends he already had. He had been so focused on trying to please people like Jake and maintain relationships with people like Sarah that he had taken his authentic friends for granted. The psychology behind this pattern revealed itself through Marcus's continued research. People who struggle with self-worth often unconsciously devalue those who treat them well while overvaluing those who treat them poorly. This is because poor treatment feels familiar to someone with underlying feelings of unworthiness, while genuine kindness feels foreign and, potentially threatening. Marcus began to understand that his transformation would require not just identifying and removing fake friends, but learning to recognize and appreciate authentic friendship when he encountered it. This meant developing what psychologists call self-compassion, the ability to treat himself with the same kindness he would show a good friend. The journey towards self-compassion proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. Years of subtle manipulation and emotional abuse from fake friends had created deep-seated patterns of self-criticism and self-doubt. Jake's undermining comments had become internalized voices that questioned Marcus's judgment and capabilities. Sarah's emotional dumping had trained him to prioritize others' feelings over his own well-being. David's financial manipulation had reinforced beliefs about his worth being tied to his utility to others. Marcus realized that destroying his weak self, the part of him that had been vulnerable to manipulation, would require more than just changing his external circumstances. It would demand a fundamental rewiring of his internal psychological landscape. He would need to develop new neural pathways that supported self-respect rather than self-sacrifice, boundaries rather than people-pleasing, and genuine self-worth rather than validation-seeking. The research on neuroplasticity provided hope for this transformation. The human brain retains the ability to form new neural connections throughout life, meaning that even deeply ingrained patterns can be changed through conscious practice and repetition. However, this process requires sustained effort and often involves temporary discomfort as old patterns are disrupted and new ones are established. Marcus began implementing what he called neural rewiring exercises, specific practices designed to strengthen psychological muscles that had been weakened by years of toxic relationships. These exercises included daily self-affirmations based on his actual achievements and positive qualities, boundary-setting practice in low-stakes situations, and conscious celebration of his own successes regardless of others' responses. One of the most powerful exercises involved what Marcus termed internal parenting, learning to provide himself with the unconditional support and validation that he had been seeking from others. This meant developing an internal voice that was consistently kind and encouraging, capable of providing comfort during difficulties and celebration during successes. The transformation wasn't linear or easy. There were days when Marcus felt intensely lonely and questioned whether his new standards for friendship were too high. The manipulative friends he had distanced himself from continued their attempts to draw him back, sometimes with tactics that triggered his old patterns of guilt and people-pleasing. Jake escalated to character assassination when his other tactics failed, spreading rumors about Marcus being selfish and thinking he's too good for his old friends. Sarah began reaching out through mutual acquaintances, painting herself as the victim of Marcus's sudden coldness. David simply disappeared entirely once it became clear that Marcus was no longer available as a financial resource. These responses confirmed what Marcus had learned about the psychology of manipulation. When manipulators lose control over their targets, they often attempt to punish them through social ostracism or character assassination. This is a predictable response designed to make the target feel guilty and return to the previous dynamic. However, Marcus was prepared for these tactics because of his psychological education. He understood that the discomfort he felt was temporary and necessary, the psychological equivalent of withdrawal symptoms as he broke free from toxic relationship patterns. He also recognized that anyone who believed Jake's character assassination without seeking Marcus's perspective was probably not someone he wanted in his life anyway. As Marcus continued his transformation, he began to notice profound changes in how he felt about himself and how he moved through the world. The constant anxiety that had characterized his interactions with fake friends began to fade. He no longer felt the compulsive need to check his phone constantly or worry about whether he had said something wrong. Most importantly, he began to experience what researchers call authentic self-esteem, confidence based on genuine self-knowledge and self-acceptance rather than external validation. This new psychological foundation would prove crucial as Marcus entered the final phase of his transformation, learning not just to identify and avoid fake friends, but to actively cultivate authentic relationships and become the kind of person who naturally attracts genuine connections. The weak self that had made him vulnerable to manipulation was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something far stronger and more resilient. 6 months after beginning his transformation, Marcus faced the ultimate test of his new psychological framework. His father's condition had worsened, requiring intensive care and around-the-clock family support. The crisis demanded both emotional resilience and practical assistance on a scale that would have devastated the old Marcus. Instead, it became the proving ground for the man he had become. The response from his carefully curated circle of authentic friends was immediate and unwavering. Emma showed up at the hospital without being asked, bringing coffee and taking over communications with extended family members. Carlos reorganized his work schedule to help with daily hospital visits. Jennifer coordinated a meal delivery system for Marcus's family and managed the logistical details that threatened to overwhelm him during the crisis. Most significantly, none of these friends made Marcus feel like a burden or kept score of their contributions. Their support flowed naturally from genuine care rather than obligation or expectation of reciprocity. This experience crystallized for Marcus the profound difference between authentic and transactional relationships, a difference that would have been invisible to him just months earlier. The contrast with his former fake friends was stark and illuminating. Jake, who had refused to help with a single work shift during Marcus's initial crisis, reached out during this more serious situation with a casual thinking of you message that required no actual effort or sacrifice. Sarah sent a lengthy text about her own experiences with family illness, somehow managing to make Marcus's crisis about her own emotional needs. David was conspicuous in his complete absence, confirming that their relationship had existed solely for his financial benefit. This crisis revealed another crucial psychological principle that Marcus had been developing: the concept of stress testing relationships. Just as engineers stress test materials to determine their breaking points, genuine friendships reveal their true nature under pressure. Authentic friends step up during difficulties, while fake friends either disappear or attempt to extract something from the crisis for themselves. Marcus realized that his father's illness, devastating as it was, had provided him with invaluable data about human nature and relationship dynamics. He could now clearly distinguish between those who loved him for who he was and those who had valued him only for what he could provide. This clarity gave him a profound sense of psychological security that he had never experienced before. The transformation in Marcus's internal landscape was equally dramatic. Where he had once felt constant anxiety about whether he was doing enough for others, he now experienced what psychologists call internal locus of control, the understanding that his worth came from his own character and choices rather than others' opinions or validation. This shift had been the result of months of deliberate psychological reconditioning. Marcus had systematically replaced his old mental programs with new ones based on self-respect rather than self-sacrifice. Instead of automatically saying yes to requests, he now paused to consider whether the request aligned with his values and capacity. Instead of seeking validation through usefulness, he focused on developing genuine skills and character traits that had intrinsic value. Most importantly, instead of fearing abandonment by unworthy people, he had learned to value solitude and authentic connection equally. This psychological evolution had been supported by what Marcus came to call mirror work, the practice of consciously observing and adjusting his own behaviors and responses in real time. He had trained himself to notice when old patterns of people-pleasing or validation-seeking began to emerge, and to consciously choose different responses that aligned with his new values. The mirror work had been particularly crucial in developing his ability to set and maintain boundaries. Marcus had discovered that boundaries weren't walls designed to keep people out, but rather filters designed to determine who deserved access to different levels of his time, energy, and emotional investment. This understanding had allowed him to create what he called graduated intimacy, a system where people earned greater access to his inner world through demonstrated authenticity and reciprocity. At the outermost level were casual acquaintances who received polite but surface-level interaction. These relationships involved minimal emotional investment and clear limits on what Marcus was willing to share or provide. Moving inward were developing friendships that had shown some signs of authenticity but hadn't yet been stress-tested by significant challenges. At the center were his proven authentic friends who had demonstrated consistent care, reciprocity, and respect for boundaries. This system protected Marcus from the psychological drain of fake friendships while allowing him to remain open to genuine new connections. It also helped him avoid the extremes of either trusting too quickly or becoming completely closed off to new relationships, both of which would have limited his potential for authentic connection. The development of this graduated intimacy system had required Marcus to overcome what he recognized as his most dangerous psychological vulnerability, the need to be liked by everyone. This need had made him an ideal target for manipulators because it prevented him from setting boundaries or making accurate assessments of people's character. Fake friends had exploited this vulnerability by offering minimal positive reinforcement in exchange for significant emotional and practical resources. Marcus's breakthrough came when he realized that being disliked by manipulative or selfish people was actually a sign of psychological health rather than failure. The approval of someone like Jake, someone who valued others only for their utility, was worthless at best and actively harmful at worst. Seeking such approval meant compromising his own values and well-being for the validation of someone whose opinion shouldn't matter to him. This realization led to what Marcus called his values clarification process, a systematic examination of what he truly believed was important in life and relationships. He discovered that his core values included authenticity, reciprocity, growth, and respect for boundaries. Any relationship that violated these values, regardless of its superficial benefits, was ultimately harmful to his well-being and development. Armed with this clarity, Marcus began actively cultivating relationships that supported his values while gracefully distancing himself from those that didn't. This wasn't a harsh or dramatic process, he simply began investing his time and energy where it would be valued and reciprocated while allowing other relationships to naturally fade through benign neglect. The results of this approach were remarkable. Within a year of beginning his transformation, Marcus's social circle had completely changed. He had fewer relationships overall, but each one was characterized by genuine mutual care and respect. The constant emotional drain that had characterized his old social life was replaced by energizing connections that left him feeling supported and valued. More importantly, Marcus had developed what psychologists call emotional sovereignty, the ability to maintain his psychological well-being independent of others' actions or opinions. This didn't mean he was indifferent to how others treated him, but rather that his core sense of self-worth was no longer dependent on external validation. He could appreciate kindness when it was offered and remain centered when it wasn't. This emotional sovereignty proved crucial when Marcus encountered new potentially manipulative individuals. His heightened awareness of manipulation tactics, combined with his strong sense of self-worth, made him an unattractive target for fake friends. He no longer emanated the subtle desperation for approval that manipulators instinctively recognize and exploit. Instead, he projected the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own value and wouldn't accept less than he deserved. Marcus discovered that authentic people were naturally attracted to this energy, while manipulative individuals either lost interest quickly or revealed their true nature through increasingly transparent attempts at exploitation. This created a natural selection process that continued to improve the quality of his relationships over time. The transformation extended beyond friendships to every area of Marcus's life. His newfound psychological strength affected his professional relationships, romantic prospects, and family dynamics. He began setting appropriate boundaries with colleagues who had previously taken advantage of his helpful nature. He attracted romantic partners who were interested in genuine partnership rather than exploitation. He even improved his relationship with family members by refusing to enable dysfunctional patterns while maintaining appropriate love and support. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marcus discovered that his capacity for genuine generosity had actually increased as he learned to distinguish between authentic giving and people-pleasing. When he helped others from a position of strength and choice rather than compulsion and insecurity, the experience was profoundly satisfying for both parties. His authentic friends valued his help more because they understood it came from genuine care rather than needy obligation. This paradox, that becoming more selective in his generosity actually made him more genuinely helpful, illustrated a key principle that Marcus had learned: psychological health creates abundance while psychological dysfunction creates scarcity. The old Marcus had felt constantly depleted because he was giving from an empty cup to people who took without appreciation. The new Marcus felt energized by his connections because he was sharing from a full cup with people who both appreciated and reciprocated. The ultimate test of Marcus's transformation came when Jake, his former fake friend, attempted a dramatic reconciliation effort nearly 2 years after their relationship had ended. Jake approached Marcus with what appeared to be genuine remorse, claiming to have recognized his past selfishness and expressing desire to rebuild their friendship on healthier terms. The old Marcus would have been deeply moved by this apparent transformation and eager to restore the relationship. The new Marcus evaluated Jake's approach with clinical objectivity, applying everything he had learned about manipulation tactics and authentic change. He noticed that Jake's apology focused more on Marcus's reaction than on specific harmful behaviors. He observed that Jake was quick to blame his past actions on external circumstances rather than taking full responsibility. Most tellingly, Jake's proposed path forward involved Marcus trusting his word rather than demonstrating change through actions over time. Marcus responded to Jake's reconciliation attempt with polite but firm boundaries. He acknowledged Jake's apparent regret while making it clear that words alone were insufficient to rebuild trust that had been systematically undermined over years. He suggested that if Jake was genuinely interested in friendship, he could demonstrate this through consistent, respectful behavior over an extended period without expecting immediate forgiveness or restoration of intimacy. Jake's response to these reasonable boundaries revealed that his approach had been another manipulation attempt rather than genuine change. He became irritated when Marcus didn't immediately accept his apology and grant him renewed access to friendship benefits. He accused Marcus of being cold and unforgiving, demonstrating that he still viewed the relationship primarily in terms of what Marcus owed him rather than what he had done to harm Marcus. This interaction confirmed for Marcus that his transformation was complete. He felt no guilt about maintaining his boundaries, no temptation to return to old patterns of people-pleasing, and no doubt about his assessment of Jake's character. The man who had once been vulnerable to such manipulation tactics had been replaced by someone who could recognize and deflect them with ease. The philosophical implications of Marcus's journey extended far beyond personal relationship management. He had discovered what ancient Stoic philosophers understood, that true strength comes not from the ability to control others, but from the ability to control oneself. The weak self that had made him vulnerable to manipulation, the self that needed external validation, feared abandonment, and confused being useful with being valuable, had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something far more resilient. Marcus realized that the phrase "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others" wasn't just a philosophical abstraction but a practical reality. By eliminating his psychological vulnerabilities, he had made himself immune to the manipulation tactics that had once controlled him. Fake friends could no longer exploit his need for approval because he provided his own validation. They couldn't manipulate him through fear of abandonment because he valued authentic solitude over inauthentic connection. They couldn't use guilt or obligation against him because he had learned to distinguish between genuine responsibility and manipulative pressure. This transformation had been painful and difficult, requiring Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and others. He had been forced to let go of familiar patterns and relationships, even when that meant periods of loneliness and uncertainty. But the result was a level of psychological freedom and authentic connection that he couldn't have imagined when he began his journey. Marcus understood that his transformation was ongoing rather than complete. Human psychology is complex and ever-evolving, and maintaining psychological health requires constant vigilance and practice. But he had developed the tools and awareness necessary to continue growing while protecting himself from those who would exploit his growth for their own benefit. The journey had taught him that authentic relationships aren't just preferable to fake ones, they're essential for psychological health and personal development. Fake friends don't just fail to support growth, they actively undermine it through subtle manipulation and exploitation. By learning to identify and eliminate these toxic relationships while cultivating authentic ones, Marcus had created an environment that supported his continued evolution rather than hindering it. As Marcus reflected on his transformation, he felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had initiated his journey. His father's illness and Jake's betrayal had been painful experiences, but they had also been catalysts for positive change that might not have occurred otherwise. The man he had become, psychologically strong, emotionally sovereign, and surrounded by authentic relationships, was capable of facing whatever challenges life presented with confidence and resilience. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that the work of destroying one's weak self and building authentic strength was not a selfish endeavor but a gift to everyone in his life. His authentic friends benefited from his psychological health because it allowed him to be genuinely present and supportive rather than needy and draining. His family benefited from his boundaries because they created healthier dynamics for everyone. Even his professional relationships improved because his colleagues could rely on his authentic responses rather than managing his emotional needs. The ripple effects of Marcus's transformation extended far beyond his immediate circle, creating a positive influence that touched everyone he encountered. By becoming genuinely strong rather than merely appearing strong, by developing authentic confidence rather than defensive bravado, and, by learning to give from abundance rather than need, Marcus had become the kind of person who naturally attracted and created healthy relationships. The man who destroys his weak self, Marcus had learned, doesn't become cold or isolated but rather becomes truly warm and connected to himself, to others, and to life itself in ways that fake relationships could never provide. This was the ultimate protection against manipulation and exploitation, not building walls, but becoming someone who naturally attracted authentic connections while remaining immune to artificial ones. Marcus's story serves as a roadmap for anyone who has found themselves vulnerable to manipulation or surrounded by fake friends. The path requires courage, patience, and sustained effort, but it leads to a life of authentic connection, psychological sovereignty, and genuine strength that can weather any storm while continuing to grow and flourish regardless of external circumstances.